And thanks for coming. Just to give you a little background, kind of how I got to where I am. I was a college coach for 11 years, but I didn't really aggressively pursue that as a career choice when I was in college. I kind of had this perception that I really didn't fit that coach material because I wasn't really authoritative, I wasn't really disciplinarian, I kind of was a lead more by example. So I didn't feel that was really consistent with what I was. And so I stumbled upon a coaching opportunity when I went to graduate school, became an assistant coach at that time, and then was in the right place at the right time to take over the head coaching reins. And that's kind of, during that time is when I figured out that I didn't have to be that specific type of coach that I had or that I had kind of constructed in my own mind, and that it was effective for me to be the type of coach that I was. But I still had to negotiate that along the way. There was athletes that really wanted me to get up in their face and yell at them, and it wasn't my nature to do that, but I still had to try to contend with that. So that's kind of how I got to where I am and why this topic, I guess, interests me, because I was lucky enough to stumble upon that as a career, but I think there's probably a lot of people that maybe aren't so lucky and maybe missed out on that a little bit. So today I'm going to share a little bit about my dissertation research. I say a little bit and share because it's still in the process. I'm still collecting data, but I've done 14 interviews, and with those first 10, I've done some data analysis, and that's what I'm presenting to you today. So first, looking at the connections between leadership and gender, there's some strong connections there. On the left side, what I have is some descriptors of what is found in more traditional leadership models. You've got this authoritative individual, a dictator, agentic, a power over or power down type of leadership. It's often called heroic individualism. And those leadership traits and characteristics are socially constructed as masculine, and as I said, they're more that traditional leadership style. On the right side, it's what we're seeing, the shift towards of a more relational type of leadership that are more feminine in characteristics, participative, collective, relational, communal, more of a power with or a power up. And Fletcher calls it a post-heroic leadership style. And she also says that while we're seeing shifts in leadership, those traditional leadership styles are remaining really persistent, particularly in the way people talk about leadership in the everyday narratives about leadership. So they're kind of stuck in that individual or heroic individualism. And thought that was a pretty strong connection to sport, particularly when you look at leadership in sport teams. There's this idea of a heroic leader, whether it be the coach or the player. And authoritative leadership is also pretty strong and consistent within leadership in sport. Looking more specifically in the literature, female athletes prefer a coach who is able to command respect, is authoritative, professional, and keeps their personal lives private. Those are traits and characteristics, again, that are associated with men and masculinity. In a similar study, Fry found that 9 out of 12 female athletes preferred male coaches, and that was based on their perception that the men had better knowledge of the sport, were better able to enforce discipline and garner respect, again, masculine traits. And we see that those expectations or gendered expectations, we see that fall upon female coaches as well, as they're often expected to be more relational, be more, develop those relationships and provide emotional labor with their athletes. But that comes at a price, because when they do that, they're often not respected then as disciplinarians. And they call that the conundrum of gender. If a female coach acts in feminine ways, she's viewed as too soft. If she acts in masculine ways, then she's not necessarily respected because it's not consistent with her gender. It's also important to note that these same researchers say that lack of experience with female coaches plays a role in the perceived preferences. And we know what these numbers are like as far as the gender appropriation of coaches. At the youth and high school level, we see 80 to 94% overall of coaches are men, leaving 6 to 20% for women. College, see similar statistics, 79% of coaches at the college level are men, while women represent only 21%, and that's overall. When you look at the college level, men coach 57% of women's teams. So that brings me to the term gendered. When you say, or to say that a practice such as leadership or a social institution such as sport is gendered, means that it symbolically described and defined in terms of masculinities and femininities. And because masculine and feminine are separate and oppositional, they're socially constructed as unequal. And so masculinity is often valued more highly or is more superior than that of femininity. You can also say that something is gendered, a job, an occupation, or an institution, based on the extent to which it's male or female dominated. So looking at the literature, you can see that leadership in sport is gendered, but there's been few studies that have looked at that, especially in terms of how female athletes view leadership. And so that's the purpose of this study, is to look at how female athletes socially construct leadership in a context that is dominated by men and certain forms of masculinities. I had 3 research questions that have guided the study. First, what are female college athletes' perceptions of leadership? And second, how do their experiences in sport inform their constructions? And then finally, if and to what extent, or if and in what ways, are female athletes' constructions of leadership gendered? So in addition to that gendered, using that as a framework, I'm also using social constructivism because it recognizes that people come to understand or build knowledge based on multi-levels. One is that it's influenced at the personal level, how they interpret their own experiences. Second, it's influenced by the interpersonal level, so communication and language within a group. And then finally, community level is shared assumptions and values within a specific socio-historic context. A little bit of background on the research design and methods. It's interpretative, qualitative design. That helps me, because it's a little bit exploratory, so that is appropriate there. Also, the context is important, and so the qualitative design helps me get at the context of sport. Sampling criteria, and again, my sample size was 10, but the sampling criteria, 4 main criteria, is that they're female college athletes at the Division I level. They've participated in at least 1 year at that level, so they have to be sophomores or above. Third criteria is that they have to have had at least 1 female coach during their experiences throughout their sport career. And then finally, that they're in team sports because of the perceived differences between team sports versus individual sports and the way they're coached. Data collection through semi-structured interviews using an interview guide, and I'm using thematic analysis for data analysis. So just to give a quick summary of how I'm presenting these findings, and again, they're initial results because it's still ongoing, but these are a few themes that have kind of risen to the top. When I first asked them to describe leadership, they describe it in terms of what they do and what their teammates do. I have to probe a little bit more to get at that leadership from that coach aspect. So there's that multi-level, there's leadership within their team and what they do, and then that of their coaches. But a couple themes for themselves and their teammates is it's an individual action, and there's 2 themes, set an example and calling people out, and those are perceived to be valued differently by their coaches compared to what they value themselves. So that's kind of just an overview, but I wanted to give a couple examples of what I found, and these are all pseudonyms that I've used here, but leadership is an individual action. I've seen this a couple times where they say leadership is somebody. So right away it goes into how it's not necessarily a process, but it's somebody or it's an individual action. Who can command a respect or command a presence within a team. Taking initiative, so being aggressive, going out on a limb, doing things when you're not told to do them. And Hannah, in this last one, leadership is leading by example in actions and communication with the rest of your team, directing them towards a goal. So I highlighted that action and communication because it starts to identify that theme of those 2 different types of leadership. And while that's not really different to have those 2 different types, we've seen this before. Has anybody used the leadership manual, Jeff Jansen's leadership manual? You see that there's lead by example and there's a vocal leadership. So it's not different to have those 2 different styles. But what I found, what's different is the way that they describe, especially the vocal leadership. They're not describing it necessarily as a vocal leadership. It's more of a calling people out, and it has a negative connotation to it. And so these are a couple examples of what they said as far as leading by example or calling people out. Harley said setting the bar as to what you should and shouldn't do off the court and on. More of a physical example, showing up on time, giving it your all, being positive, so it's just that leading by example. Justine said if somebody's not working hard in the gym, calling them out. And Bryn described a situation in which she had to call out a teammate. I said, it's not okay, I laid that down, and I had to confront her about it. So when you look at what coaches value, or their perceptions of what is valued by their coaches, you can see that Hannah described herself as more of a relational leadership, more of a quiet leader, and I asked her, did your coach want you to be more vocal? She said, not necessarily, but the loud style was more valuable in her eyes as captain material. She didn't think that her style was captain material. And then she went on to say that she liked people to hold the standard, to be kind of like a dictator, and to be hard on people. So that's where that calling people out kind of had that negative connotation to it again. And Ashley described more of a positive situation where a teammate was rewarded for calling people out. So they see that there's that reward associated with that. Her teammate took it upon herself to get a team meeting together, went through everybody telling them how they weren't doing their roles. And she said, I think the coaches were happy that someone else was doing that someone else took it upon themselves to take it in their own hands. And she went on to say how this teammate was named an honorary captain for the rest of the season for doing that. So there is reward to calling people out, or they're seeing that. I didn't have this one up here, but Carly described, I wasn't very vocal as a leader. I led by example, and I never noticed how important the vocal side of leadership was until I got to college. And the coaches are forcing me to be more vocal and to be more of that vocal leader instead of just lead by example. But as far as how athletes prefer to lead themselves, oftentimes they prefer to be more of that lead by example type, based on their work ethic and keeping everybody together. Justine said, I liked to be that glue within the team. And Erin, she said that it was between her and Sarah as far as being captain. Sarah got it, and she said, I think that's cool because I can step up into that quieter role and be and set more of a physical example. She went on to say, I didn't include this, but I love this quote. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I can suggest things that can help you in a casual way. Because you don't want to step on toes. That's what she said. You don't want to step on toes. And that kind of brings it to this idea of stepping on toes. This is kind of a long quote, I know, but Grace described an experience where she did step on toes, and she received some lashback from one of her teammates from it and took it personally. I'll let you read that one. So that experience influenced her because she thought she was just being a leader and saying, hey, as a group, we can't do that. But somebody flashed back at her, and so she took it personally. And she went on to say how she's evolved and changed her leadership a little bit based on that. So when she got to college, I found that when I came to college, I was still expected to call people out. But I didn't want people to hate me. I didn't want my teammates not to be around me, so she found a balance in that. And Hannah also described how her early experiences weren't really met with that same reaction, and so because she had negative reaction, she evolved and she changed. People didn't receive it well, even if it wasn't meaning to be harsh or anything. It's just the tone of voice didn't come off well, so I evolved and I changed. So I think that really shows that their relationships with their teammates are really important to them, and they don't want to jeopardize that, or to call people out or to step on toes is really kind of a negative thing in their minds. Okay. So moving on to perceptions related to coaches. I'm just going to kind of share a few things here. This is really in the initial stages, but it's multifaceted and complex. I've listed the different themes that have emerged because you see them across all of the interviews, or not necessarily across all of the interviews, but within the different data extracts, you can see aspects of these: relational, knowledgeable, being a disciplinarian, and encouraging. And I think this first one really describes it really well. She was encouraging. She knew a lot about the sports, so she was knowledgeable too. I respected her, but she was hard on us, so she was also a disciplinarian. And I made a personal connection with her. So you can see so many different things in that and how she described her ideal leader who was a coach. Justine also described this contradictory idea of he was your friend, but once you got on the court, it was all business. If there were any problems, it was instantly calling it out and putting an end to it. And he created that trust and that bond, so there's that relational aspect as well. In Carly's quotes, relational aspect, you respected him, he was knowledgeable. So again, you see all these different aspects. And my favorite one, I saved for the end, she's always keeping it light, but she's still very intense. She calls herself the Iron Fist with the Velvet Glove. I loved that quote because it just said so much about being a female head coach, because you've got to have that iron fist, but you're a woman, so you have to have some softness about it. So you put on the velvet glove, then you can kind of negotiate that role a little bit better. So what does this all mean, or what do I think it means? Take-home messages for coaches and practitioners is that negotiation, how female athletes negotiate their own leadership style. It's influenced by their teammates. It's also influenced by what their coaches expect of them, but probably more so by what's expected, or what their relationships with their teammates. And because of that, I think it's important for coaches to positively develop vocal side of leadership. So there's some reason why that's coming across as negative to them, so trying to focus more positively on it's okay to hold people accountable. That's an important aspect of a leader, so trying to focus on that more positively. And then just the idea that female athletes do value that multifaceted and complex leadership from coaches. And the take-home message as far as future research, I think what I found is that there seems to be some aspects of heroic individual leadership that's persisting, but you're also seeing some resistance in how female athletes are doing leadership themselves, and that relational aspect of who they think is the ideal leader. So anytime we can highlight that resistance, it's important in research to do that, because it can lead to small incremental changes. So if we can continue to do that. And the second thing I thought was interesting, can female athletes really be that disciplinarian, be personable, develop relationships, and still maintain respect? Because the previous literature has showed us that they can't. So I think we should maybe look at that a little bit more. Are things changing in that respect? Can female athletes be successful, or female coaches be successful in that type of a leadership style? And then finally, examining the perceptions, the negative perceptions that's associated with vocal leadership or calling people out. So, any questions?
So what we'll do is, each of the presenters will present about 15 minutes, so they do time on the dot there, and then we'll do a little Q&A, and then we'll move on. So if you have comments, questions, anything, let's take a few minutes for that, and then we'll turn it over to speaker number 2.
Yeah.
Did you, talking about the girls when they were talking about being a captain or a leader, like
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'll be a leader.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find out how they are elected captain? Is it the coach's choice? Is it the player's choice? And I'm wondering
Yeah.
if that had any effect on their feelings of it.
That wasn't part of my interview guide, and I haven't really asked them that explicitly. Some of them have shared it a little bit, but I didn't focus on that so much.
Vicki, how hard was it to find so far female athletes who have had a female coach? Has that been a limitation in your sample?
It hasn't so far. I haven't eliminated anybody because of that, and I think what helps is that these are Division I female athletes. They're at the elite level. So at some point in time, whether it be a development program, even if it was a short, program that they worked with during the summer, they had a female coach that's headed that. So, and there's 2 athletes that I was kind of like, okay, are they qualified because they haven't had a head female coach, but they've had this female coach in travel ball or something like that. And so that's helped that they are elite athletes, because it's helping include some. So, but I was kind of surprised. I was expecting to have more that didn't. So I think the challenge, I've just started interviewing hockey players, and that's been a little bit more challenging. But it says more about the sport than. Jen.
They talk all about their leadership styles changing as they kind of move through, and as one group leaves, seniors leave, and then as juniors come up, they may have to change.
Yeah, they've talked about how their leadership has evolved kind of over the course of their career. So not specifically with from year to year.
Especially in terms of what the coach may expect of
yeah.
a group of seniors that are very vocal or very not vocal, whatever it
Right.
may be, and then they graduate, and then you have sort of a new group that comes up, and it's a different dynamic on the team. So the coach expectations may change as the team kind of
Yeah, that's a good question. They don't reflect on that too much. I mean, there's been a couple of people that have talked about that have had a big group of seniors before them, and that they had to step up at a younger role. So they've talked about as juniors, we all of a sudden had to be the leaders on our teams because we didn't have any seniors. So it was that kind of thing. But they didn't say that the expectations were different from their coaches. They kind of viewed it as the same as what the class before them was doing, was the same expectations for them. Yeah.
Do the athletes have a different leadership style based on the gender of the coach?
Do they themselves have a different leadership style? That's a good question. I'm not asking them that. If the gender of their coach influences how they do gender themselves. I think that's a interesting research question, though, maybe. Yeah, Katie.
How many of them express that they enjoy their sport experience?
That's another good question. What I've found, I played Division II and coached Division III. And so what I'm finding is that I feel like I'm seeing a little bit more jaded views from them because they just accept that the head coach is the head coach. It's a winning, they don't describe their head coaches as leaders. That's another thing that has kind of come out. They describe that ideal leader as an assistant coach or a previous coach, but not their head coach because they're a college coach and that's their job. And so I think they view that a little differently in that respect. Did that answer your question? Oh, right. You don't want me to take this one back? I know, and do my commentary.
Katie will tell you a little bit about her work, but this is kind of a preview of perhaps her master's defense, which is coming up very shortly. So, Katie, take it away.
Great. It's actually next week, so here's hoping it goes well. Okay, just thank you all for coming. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my research interest, and the reason this is my interest is because of what I do in life. So I myself am an athlete. I play rugby. Most everybody knows I'm the rugby person here at school. So it's really no secret. If you don't know, now you do. So what I've really tried hard to do is not make it all rugby and make it more sport, interesting across the board. So I'm also the head coach of the University of Minnesota women's rugby team here. Many of my athletes are here. Thank you for coming. Okay. Also, I do work for USA Rugby as a coach educator. So I work with a lot of coaches. I actually see a couple of you that have taken courses from me too. So thank you for coming. So that's sort of my background, why I became interested in this. Where I first found out about it was Psychology of Coaching course here, which I like to think of it as therapy class for me. As other coaches, if you've taken that class, it's absolutely excellent. So this is where I first found out about this concept of millennials, and they're integrated into the world that I live in. And I started to notice some trends, and when I first took on the role as a head coach, I was like, oh man, there's so much to do, and I'm not really understanding what's happening. And then this came to me, and I said, this is the answer. So here we go. So to start off, take a look at this quote. And you'll notice a couple of things. So my question for this whole line of research is, why do we care about millennials? Okay, and to me, if you look at it, I like the concept of it actually being seen as upbeat and engaging. A lot of the media and resources out there say, oh, millennials, they're lazy, they're entitled. Okay, if you haven't heard that, you probably will. Google search millennial, it'll come up and you'll read it. Okay, the other concept is that it's potentially seismic for America, right? So if anything that's going to have that much of an impact, I'm pretty interested in it and I want to find out why. Okay? So, and if you look at that picture, these are the kids that I coach around that age. Okay, so to first get started, we'll have to define what a generation is. So Strauss and Howe, they've looked at everything from people and events that have happened from 1584 on, and they continue to do so. So I consider that enough theoretical background for them to be pretty much experts on it. Yeah, so they look from there on through it. Yep. So they describe it as a cohort whose length approximates the span of a phase of life and whose boundaries are fixed by personality. So that says a lot about personality, interesting things that happen to them. The other one is identified more specific, which Cooper-Schmidt talked about, is birth years, age, location, significant life events at critical developmental stages. So that pretty much sums up what a generation is. If you've ever heard the song My Generation or anything generation, that's what it's all about. So millennial athletes, who are they? Okay, they are the trophy kids. Right? They are the kids that were brought up in youth sports environments that got snacks after they played, and they got trophies for participating, and they were told how wonderful and special they are. Okay? They grew up. Okay? They're here. Some of them are in this room, people that I coach. Okay, so they are born approximately in or after 1982. I was born in 81, so I'm right on the edge. Okay? I'm Gen X, sort of. But there's a lot of me that's millennial too, as I've come to find out. They are the current high school and collegiate athletes, and they're also known as Generation Y, although they prefer millennial. It's more of a unique, interesting term. Gen X implies they're after. Gen X and Gen Y implies that they're after Gen X. They're more special than that. So, current coaches. So, if you were born between the years of 1943 and 1960, go ahead and stand up. We've got one, absolutely. two, there we go. Okay, so you are, there you go. All right, so you are a product of the baby boomer generation, okay? And they talk about specific significant events. There's a whole book that's about this thick that talks about the specific events that really have impacted your generation and shaped what you know and why and your values and beliefs. Some of the more important ones are Vietnam War, Watergate, the Reagan Revolution. You can start to think about where were you at those times, how did they impact you. If you were born between 1961 and 1981, go ahead and stand up. There we go, we've got a few more. Okay, you can take a seat. All right, so you are Generation X. Okay, Roe versus Wade, war in the Middle East, a number of different significant events that have happened and impacted you. Millennials, okay, here you are, stand on up. Absolutely. Okay, so many of you can probably remember the Columbine Massacre and how that impacted you. Okay, how many people had metal detectors in their schools? That's probably a big part of it, all right? And also social networking. How many of you spent endless hours on Facebook instead of doing the homework you should be doing because it's finals time? Okay, I'm in that boat too, don't worry about it, but I consider it research. Okay, so good news. Here's the good news, okay? Millennial athletes out there, you are known as collaborative, diverse, technological, highly educated, confident, team-oriented, respectful, and conventional. If I had a team full of those, which I do mostly, okay, I would absolutely have no problems in life whatsoever with coaching, I think, okay? So they're also driven to achieve and impress significant others. Okay? If you're teachers or coaches, how many of them really want that feedback all the time or really will do anything, okay, to just impress you, okay, to make your day by saying, I learned something new. Also, they do have a strong connection to parental figures. Okay? This is a good thing in a lot of ways because those parents that brought the snacks, okay, and drove the carpool to the youth sport events, okay, they are now grown up and they're running your booster clubs if you're in high school or if you're at college, or they're even your assistant coach, which might be very helpful. Okay, so here's the not so good news. Okay? They can also be described as needy, sheltered, lazy, entitled, arrogant, anxious, pressured, impatient, non-committal, and argumentative. Okay? So there's some good and there's some bad somewhere in there, both sides of the story. Okay? They are often pressured into early specialization. A lot of times parents, those parent figures. Okay, so you think about helicopter parents, right? That's sort of the not so good side of it. So see how it can be a positive, but it's also a not so good side too. Okay, so those parents that are calling you saying, why isn't Johnny or Susie getting the playing time that she deserves? That's something that you have to deal with as well. So, but this early specialization is really driven, okay, by this parental idea that you'll get this college scholarship or this will help you in life. So they're trying to do the best they can for their kids. So it really influences them. So here's some anecdotal evidence. I'm also a physical activity program teacher here. I teach rugby, shocking, and soccer class. Okay, and one of the assignments I gave my soccer class was that they get to pick their own team names. Okay, being unique and individual millennials. Guess what their team names were? Team Make Friends. Okay, social, collaborative. Okay, they did this all on their own. That was fantastic. I was, thank you, soccer class. Barcelona Football Club, diverse, team-oriented. And the Candy Cobras, special. Confident, okay? You have a name like Candy Cobras and you're playing a competitive sport, you're probably pretty special. And you probably think you're pretty good. Okay, so here, back to think about, these are some matchups. Okay, this is sort of a conglomeration of all the different resources, that interdisciplinary sources of information, which is in education, management, all sorts of different places that you can find this information on millennials. Like I said, if you Google search it, it'll come to every number of journal in the world. Here it is. I've sort of summarized it all. Okay, and the thing to think about here is if you look in your category, based on when you stood up, based on your birth year, okay, you're probably thinking right now, some of these are not quite me, or some of these are more me. Like for me, I think I'm more technologically apprehensive. Okay, so I'm probably more the baby boomer side there, right? And my athletes will agree with me because they teach me how to use technology every day. Thank you. They help me with this presentation even. Okay, so, but those that know me, I'm not very cynical. Okay, so I'm Gen X. So you can also think about is that these are sort of more views that have come from, you know, different events that have happened in life, but they're not written in stone. Okay, you can pick and choose or kind of slide one way or another dependent on when you were born. Me being on the edge between Gen X and millennial, I might have more millennial characteristics. It all depends on the individual. So we'll talk a little bit about the impact on coaching effectiveness. So I started to think, wow, there's some sort of phenomenon going here. I really have to find out what it is. So I found Horn's working model of coaching effectiveness. And what it really serves to look at is how these situational and individual differences really work to become or help coaches be effective or ineffective. So what you look at is there's different sport contextual factors that play a big role in it, and they mediate the link between coaches' behavior and coaches' behavior and athletes' performance and behavior. And those contextual factors are things like what's your sport type, what are you playing, what's your competitive level, and your personal characteristics. And personal characteristic, what's your age? Okay, so how does your age play a role in that? So that for me was a big sort of aha, light bulb moment of this is why this happens. Okay, and if you go through, so now we're trying to look, okay, you know all about it. We understand who the millennials are. We understand what generation you fall into. We know the role that it plays in coaching effectiveness. So what does this have to do with female coaches? So Vicki did such a great job of talking about leadership elements, so it kind of works really well into mine. So what I found was a study about female leadership that was Egli, Johansson, Schmidt, and Van Agen. And Vicki and I actually talked about it a little bit before. And it's a meta-analysis of 45 studies on gender differences in leadership style. They found overall that females are more transformational. Okay? That means they're more supportive and they're more encouraging of their subordinates. Okay? When they are more transactional, it's when it has to do with contingency reward behaviors. Okay? The good news is that they're both related positively to effective leadership. So how does that kind of, from that study that's more based in psychological and management workplace theory, how does it transfer over into the sporting field? Well, if you think about it, millennial athletes thrive under consistent supervision and when they have positive feedback and reinforcement. Okay, that sounds a lot like that transformational component of leadership that we talked about. So, matches up nicely with what millennials are looking for. Okay, they also will work hard for tangible rewards. So the time that they are transactional, okay, that's what the athletes are looking for, and they're saying, wow, I want to be rewarded for the behavior that I'm doing, and I'm going to work for it. So that's an element that's really sort of works to, in female coaches' benefit. The other, think about it, if you think about what's the most important thing to you young people that are here in this room, it's logically probably your social connections. Okay, the Sporting Good Manufacturing Association just came out with a report that pretty much tracks the sport interest and different components. They said that Generation Y, or the millennials, is most interested in any sort of social activity through physical activity. Okay? They also said that there's a 50% increase in sports like rugby and lacrosse, which is awesome. So, but what we think about is that they are very looking to form these great relationships. So, and most everybody knows that women are more relational in general. Okay? The last component of it is that they are comfortable with this autonomy, supportive leadership style. And it's just like back home, right? The homes that they were brought up in, where mom and dad are sitting around and trying to figure out how to work the TiVo, who do you think helped them? Okay? It was their kids, right? Their kids are experts in the eyes of their parents, in the eyes of their authority figures, right? So when they get to a sporting environment, they're used to saying, hey, coach, here's how you do it, okay? Or I think I know better, because that's how they were brought up. Okay, so they're used to being able to have decisions and being able to make decisions and impact what's going on. So, the coach's to-do list, okay? Coming away from this, tell your friends, teammates, athletic directors, anybody you know, all these great things that align with this new group of young people, high school and collegiate athletes. Okay, let them know here's what they're about, here's what they like, here's what works for them, and tell them that that's what female leaders do. Okay, so female leaders do these things, millennials are looking for them, you might want to hire them, you might want to play for them, you might want to look for that opportunity. Okay, you can also learn from your athletes. On our team, we talk about having technology moments of the day. Okay, so for me, being technologically apprehensive, I learn something new every day. There's not a practice that doesn't go by that they don't tell me something about my smartphone or Facebook or whatever happens. It also opens up new lines of communication, and it just helps me get along. If they're going to use it, I might as well figure out a way to use it too. Okay, also share my personal values, beliefs, experiences, and skills with my athletes. Okay, so as much as YouTube and Twitter are great things to use, okay, nothing beats a sit-down one-to-one conversation where you have to talk to an athlete about playing time or another issue. Okay, so old school sometimes is just as good as new school. And also to embrace these differences as opportunities. Okay, if you look back to that first slide, back to that quote, ignore some of these things that say how millennials will cause you headaches and cause you problems. Okay, look at it as it's an opportunity, right? It's something new for you to learn. I've learned more in these last 2 years coaching this group of girls than I've ever done before, simply because I was open to it. Okay, and also look for new stuff to use when coaching. Okay, I read a whole lot of management books now, so I get away from these coaching books all the time. So I look at education, I look at all sorts of different areas to find information that will help me to be a more effective coach. And I never thought of it, okay, until I came here, sought this education, learned something new from previous coaches. So what's up next? The next generation, they're still looking to kind of come into their own and create this identity. Okay, they're called the global generation, or Generation Z even. They're not even settled on that name yet, so who knows? Okay, who knows what's going to be coming up in the future? Okay, also, what's next for female coaches? Okay, my hope is that with this information, you can take this out, talk to different people, spread the word, and that number that seems to be decreasing since Title IX for female coaches will start to increase, because people will start to see, wow, leadership characteristics of females, they work perfect. Okay, they're absolutely wonderful for this new generation. And last, thanks athletes, because you guys every day, you make me want to learn more and make me be a better coach. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you for the explanation of why my semester went the way it did.
That's how I felt about the first 3 weeks of being the head coach. Really, they're non-committal in general. Like they have so many multiple diverse interests, and if you look at the other thing is community involvement. So, or they're also the generation that was, because of early specialization and this drive to get these scholarships, parents, they're the first generation that was told, don't get a job, study hard, right? Study hard and do the Peace Corps or do something else that's going to help you get that scholarship. So they have all these diverse interests. So sometimes their priorities are just a little bit different. So, but the data, I'm sure it's out there. I haven't read it specifically, but it'd be really interesting to collect that data. This is actually just kind of a collaboration of information about this group. There's so much potential for open qualitative and quantitative studies for this area of research. Go to town, people. It'll be fun. I think there is some information. It's kind of more in the workplace setting. So again, opens up, if we could collect data on coaches in this line, definitely I'm sure those themes would emerge. But if you look at millennials in comparison with baby boomers, a lot of their characteristics kind of match a bit more. You know, if you look at it, confident, optimistic. So in between is Gen X going, wow, I'm cynical. And the largely big part of their being so cynical is some of their authority figures. If you look at Bill Clinton and other things that went on at that time, how do they trust those authority figures? So that kind of led to some of their cynicism. But if you look at, you know, different things, collaborative, team-oriented, entitled, hardworking, but they kind of match a bit more, or at least they're easier to understand. And from what I've noticed, the biggest gap is that technology component, but that's pretty easily, you know, bridged if you're just open to learn new things. And both learn, I think, from the boomers to Gen Y, I think they learn the most from each other in terms of sort of old school, you know, personal interaction methods that boomers rely on more, and then to use technology really does help enhance your ability to coach from an older generation perspective.
Just kind of going along with another question too, is this difference between hardworking and entitled. I think there are parts that may lead people to leave early because they don't.
Yep.
Big disconnect.
Yep. And then back to everybody is different. You know, you might, and it depends on your own personal experience, where you were brought up, your values, your beliefs. So, like, if you happen to be Amish, you're probably not really technologically fluent. So, but you might be in that generation, things like that. Any other questions? Thank you.
Okay, in the transition, if you need some more pizza or you want to refill your soda,
Pass it this way.
Yeah, that's it.
It's awkward.
Okay, next up we have another master's student, Alyssa Norris, who is also going to be defending shortly. And on this theme of coaching and females, athletes, and coaches, Alyssa is going to share her work with us. So, Alyssa, it's all yours.
All right. Well, first of all, having just wrapped up my thesis, it came to a lovely 180 pages, which I'm sure my committee appreciates greatly. So trying to condense this in 15 minutes, I'm really trying to take away the points that'll be meaningful for you. So if anything in this is really interesting to you and you want to have a further conversation, please, I'd love to. I have a lot more information and some more links that I won't be going over fully here today. But I'm going to give you a few ideas about why I became interested in this in general, based on research, recent news, and my own personal background. So first, turning to research. Pre-Title IX, we had over 90% of the proportion of female head coaches of women's sports and intercollegiate athletics. Nice little, huge percentage, actually. Pre-Title IX, before all these athletes sort of inundated. Now, in 2010, 42.6%, as Vicki mentioned in her presentation. So while female athletes have really ballooned from 16,000 to 180,000, the proportion of female head coaches for these female athletes has really plummeted. So this question about why women leave coaching has really nagged researchers in this field. You know, dating back to when this data first came out in the late 70s and 80s, we've had a host of explanations. Dr. Lavoie and Julia actually have compiled a lot of them, which is very helpful for me in organizing them. We basically have four main categories: structural, organizational, interpersonal, and individual. So at that structural level, sort of what Vicki was mentioning as well, those perceptions that sport is masculine, that it's a masculine domain, that male coaches thus are the ones who are naturally good at coaching and that women might not belong. Organizational barriers, things like homologous reproduction, which Dr. Kane has researched in the past, and then getting to interpersonal work-family conflict, so this idea that maybe women have a harder time negotiating that than male coaches do. And at the individual level, time constraints, perceiving yourself as having less competence than male coaches, and not being as experienced, not deserving of the job. But on the other hand, you can look at it as why are women leaving coaching, but at the same time, why are women not entering coaching? So there is definitely a combination of both, which you can clearly see in the data because there are actually over 60% proportion of female assistant coaches for these women's teams. So again, we're at 40% for the head, 60% for the assistant. So what's going on? Again, is it structural, organizational? Are they not getting hired? Are they facing discrimination? Or is there something about them individually about why they're not going into it? Research in this area, Cunningham and Sagas in particular, have done quite a bit of research in the past about 15 years and found that female assistant coaches do believe they're less competent. They do believe they need more experience. And the male coaches also perceive that they have a social network already in place. So they feel like their mentors and their mentorships are really boosting them, really helping them get to that next level, whereas female assistant coaches aren't necessarily seeing it that way. So what's going on there? And then in particular, where are the gay coaches? So I mean this literally and figuratively. Literally, where are they? As Dr. Lavoie's research with Austin Calhoun, who spoke at the Tucker table previously, showed only 2 coaches out of a sample of 1,850, something like that, were out in their online coaching bios. So truly, where are they? Before I touch on research, I want to define 2 things right now. So I'm going to be talking about heterosexism in my presentation today. Homophobia is sort of this original view, the irrational fear of homosexuals and homosexuality, whereas heterosexism is this new term that's come up, fancy to throw around, but easier to understand if I outline it for you. So don't ask, don't tell is a great example. Heterosexism basically says that our society privileges heterosexuality, privileges heterosexual relationships, identities, and then denigrates and stigmatizes those who are not heterosexual. So don't ask, don't tell is a great example, but it can be much simpler. It can be you meeting someone and them asking you, do you have a boyfriend? When are you getting married? Aren't you getting up in age? Shouldn't you be getting, knocked up by now? Where's the baby? So all of that kind of thing, all of those kinds of things are examples. They're assuming you're heterosexual just based upon your gender. So what does the research say about gay coaches? Well, we've had 2 great studies recently that have done qualitative research, interviews with lesbian coaches. First, Crane and Barber, and they found that lesbian coaches feel it is necessary to conceal their identities. So they feel it is necessary to be out in their personal lives and are happy doing so, but when it comes to work, it's work. I leave my lesbian identity at home, and this is my workplace, and it just doesn't happen. I can't be successful and be a gay coach. On the other hand, Amy Sandler, who also spoke at a previous Tucker table, did some in-depth research on how they perceive heterosexism as influencing their career trajectories. And what she found was that it does, and they do really feel it has an impact, not only on their professional outcomes, so whether or not they're satisfied in their jobs, but also on how they interact with their staff and how they're doing personally. So she found it had led for a few coaches to relationship issues, divides between them and their girlfriends or partners because they were not inviting them to events. They were not ever allowed to be anywhere. They were not ever acknowledged. On the other hand, sort of led to some identity struggles in general. So they felt guilty over having these concealed identities. It was something they were proud of outside of the profession, and here they were covering it up, and some of them felt guilty about that. And then some of them also passed this knowledge on. So they sort of instilled this in their assistant coaches, gay or straight, one of whom in particular had a lesbian assistant coach who she told specifically not to be so out. Made her uncomfortable. She felt it wasn't projecting a good image for the staff, and she felt like it would hurt them going forward. So she told her to please remain more closeted. So it does have real effects. It's not just in the research. It's not people saying it affects them. Lesbians in coaching, unfortunately, face an uphill battle. So we talk about sport as being a masculine domain. If it's masculine, it's also privileging this heterosexuality. So lesbian coaches have not only to face this hurdle as a woman, but to face this hurdle as a lesbian in sport. So Katie Brenny, who was our former golf coach, actually was, according to her lawsuit, forced out from her position once the sort of director of golf found out that she was gay. Lawsuit currently pending. Basically, they told her she could not have as much contact with the players, she was not allowed to travel, and she was offered a sales position over at TCF, which is great when you're coming here to coach, to go do some sales for TCF. And then getting to that assistant coaching piece again, IUPUI. Not sure how many heard about this, but Shan Hart was the head coach, was ousted from there, fired because players and assistant coaches alleged that she pried into their personal lives trying to find out who was dating who and who was gay, and sort of trying to bring that to light so she could push them out as well. Personal, a lovely photo of myself in prime awkward phase. Thought I would share that with you. But personally, I played basketball since I was 4 or 5 with the boys. Going into college, I've had a lot of friends who've graduated and gone into coaching themselves and who've had a really hard time as lesbian assistant coaches. It's their dream to coach. They love the sport. They want to make a difference. And they also come into the sport already out. So we talk about those millennial differences. Again, Katie mentioned they're more diverse. So they're more accepting of diversity. It's shown attitudes towards homosexuals over the past 3 decades have really improved. So people are already coming out and open, and they're coming into these roles where they're being instructed not to be so out. I also come from a psychology background, so for me, these sociological studies and these aspects are really interesting, but at the same time, it's more interesting to me what effects are these sort of, restraints having on the assistant coaches themselves. Because looking at organizational research and workplace satisfaction research, these disclosure disconnects, so whether you're out in work or not, whether you're out at home and silent in work, that kind of disconnect actually leads to lower job satisfaction for lesbians and gay men. And it can also lead to some very negative mental health outcomes, which leads me to the framework I used. Meyer basically argues, fancy words again, but that stress is mixed with how you cope with that stress and how you manage your identity, and it can lead to negative mental health outcomes. So by stress, I mean, are people constantly asking me when I'm getting married and do I have a boyfriend? Are people making gay jokes all the time? Are people telling me to manage my identity? And then am I out and open in the workplace, or am I disconnecting those? And then, do I end up happy, or do I end up with anxiety or depression or things like that? So my particular research, I spoke to lesbian assistant coaches of Division I women's basketball, 7 current, 3 former, mixed methods. They completed some surveys for me and also qualitative interviews, some upwards of an hour. And wanted to address this because I know it seems very specific, but at the same time, the proportion of coaches in different sports varies. So again, it's almost highest in women's basketball, 57%, whereas soccer, it's down at 32%. So these different gender norms for the sport and also the level of coaching, I didn't feel it was appropriate to lump different sports into one. Okay, so what I found. Basically, short story, not everyone has a negative experience, which is fantastic. 3 coaches were openly out not only with their staff and their head coach, but also with their team, which is great, sort of unheard of in the previous research with head coaches, so that's fantastic. Some of them really enjoyed their jobs. Some of them did not. So I'm going to pick apart their perceptions and their experiences within the climate and then talk about some of the outcomes that some of the coaches mentioned. When I asked them to describe their climate and how they perceived the climate for lesbians in athletics, I really found that it differed. There was women's basketball as a whole, and then there was my department and my team. So some coaches felt it was the same, and some coaches had very different experiences within the among the 2 levels. So in terms of general women's basketball, all of the coaches described it very negatively. Homophobic, hostile, tolerant, but not accepting. So it was mentioned that it was very silent. You were not supposed to be out as a coach at all in intercollegiate athletics. It was frowned upon, and coaches basically felt like you're young, you're attractive, and you're straight is the way to be successful. They were specifically told this, some of them. Others just implied it from their experiences. So Jackie actually had a head coach who told her this. Of course, she was not out to this coach. So he just always assumed she was straight and really pounded this into her head from the first day on the job. This is why you're going to do well, and being straight is part of it. Now, departmental team climate, first focusing on negative. They all spoke about it being very top-down, so the influence of the head coach and administration in creating these climates. Arizona in particular came in and really wanted to make a difference for lesbian and straight athletes alike, and felt like she met this wall because the administration really didn't support it. They specifically told her not to be so out. Generational difference. A lot of them spoke about this generational difference. So as Katie was mentioning, from coach to athlete, but also from coach to coach. So there is this divide from young assistant coaches, my sample being all under 34, and their head coaches, who are most of them from a previous generation. And in that generation, the lesbians from what some of them called the old guard are very secretive about their identities. And Arizona really described that as shaping how assistant coaches manage their identities. So maybe they come in open, but they decide not to be, because they're the ones controlling the hiring and firing. They're the ones who are on your resumes. So if you don't follow what they say, you're pretty much screwed. You're not going to go anywhere in the career that you hope to. So actual discriminatory experiences, many of them were set up on dates. Many of them felt that athletes and other coaches gossiped about them. Some were accused of sleeping with players once the head coaches found out that they were gay. Some were suddenly assigned, like Katie Brenny, to menial tasks. They had to go to athletes' rooms and collect cell phones on trips, and they had to stay up until 11:30 making sure everyone was asleep while all the other assistant coaches got to leave. So this idea that once people found out, they really felt like they were being forced out of the position. Again, not crossing legal lines because no one's firing you, but you don't really have a choice to stay in it. As I mentioned, Arizona was specifically told to stay quiet. And then this one really bothered me. I'm sweating like a lesbian in church was what Jackie's coach often said. And I mean, self-explanatory on that one. All of them also mentioned the importance of negative recruiting, how it really limited their ability to be open. You really want to say something, but you're not going to be able to keep going in your job. You're not going to get athletes. There's this belief that athletes won't come to your school. Your athletic department will fire you if they find out you're telling recruits that you're open. So while I had 3 coaches that were out with their teams, 0 were open when recruiting and said it was absolutely a no-no, would never do. And then this idea of family that came out in the ESPN article recently, family-friendly, to convey this atmosphere of heterosexuality, non-homosexuality, homosexuals are not allowed here. They spoke of hearing it as an athlete, of other coaches using it against them, and of just hearing it in the general recruiting circuit. Now, how did they manage their identity on the negative side? Dual identities, which led to, for some of them, to alienation. They felt like it prohibited them from forming bonds with their coaches and their athletes, and also sadness. So I felt like I was 2 people. I had to be this one person at work and this one person at home. And because of that, they felt like they weren't able to form open, honest relationships, which they had a really, really hard time with. So it wasn't the fact that they felt guilty about anything. It was the fact that they felt this drove a wedge between them and other people. For others, it led to this relationship strain, which I mentioned earlier. When they were with people and they were not bringing them to events, they were not introducing them to anyone. They didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, they realize now how hurtful that was to that person. They recognize now why that person was angry and how that must have affected them and their relationship. And then finally, hypervigilance. So this idea that you're constantly monitoring yourself. You never want someone to find out because you're very fearful about what will happen. Anxiety and identity struggles in general. So these young coaches coming out of college, some of them may think they're gay, but they don't quite know. And for a lot of them, these experiences delayed their acceptance of their identity, delayed them coming out. Jackie in particular had an awful, awful time. Really did not describe this as a positive time in her life, and subsequently was anxious and depressed, very sad about her entire experience. Okay, now the generational differences in terms of how it affected them, what they wanted to do. Those who had worked for lesbian coaches, 4 of them had. None of those lesbian coaches were out. And as I mentioned, some of them were more negative than others, telling people to stay closeted. But these coaches really looked at that as an opportunity. It showed them that that's not what I want to do. I want to have those open, honest relationships, and I want to foster that in my athletes. So I might not be open now with my coach, or I might not be as open as I want to be, but I know that I want to get there. That's my goal. So how about those who experience a positive climate? What can we do to switch this around? We can actively promote tolerance. Christina really felt like it wasn't by coincidence that this climate existed. It was her head coach really actively creating it, creating these team rules of respect and communication up front from the get-go, and actively addressing homophobia on the team. And then become involved with your staff on a personal level. So it's not just, hey, how's that report going? How was your weekend? Hey, how's your girlfriend? How was she? You know, how'd that visit go? Really went a long way with these participants, more than I expected. They really, really valued this above all else. And really felt like it helped them know how to move forward. So they're talking about it, and they're learning from their mentors about what to do or what not to do in this case. And then this positive identity performance, being open. They really thought that this was making change. They knew that they weren't creating change on a wide level, but they felt like it was their responsibility to do within their program to really help these athletes. They don't know, maybe it didn't help them, but they felt like at least they were giving them the opportunity to learn from them. And maybe it did, maybe it helped a few feel more comfortable about who they were because they were able to do so themselves. Job satisfaction. On the negative side, again, this idea that identity disconnects and heterosexist experiences can really lead to these negative job outcomes. Arizona really felt like it was specifically the athletic director and head coach telling her to be quiet that led her to wish to leave. And she was one of the only participants that didn't want to become a head coach, unfortunately. So perhaps some leak there. But how do we balance your departmental climate and the women's climate as a whole? Really hard to say. It's not that one can boost the other or buffer the other. One coach had a great experience, was out with her team, and her head coach was very tolerant and accepting. But this idea that she might get fired in the future, that she might not get a job in the future, that she might have to suddenly restrict her identity was really hard for her to negotiate, and she was struggling with it throughout the entire interview. She couldn't quite make up her mind. So how do we create change? How do we move forward? As coaches, coaching staffs demonstrate interest. So it's about your coaches as human beings. It's not just about how they're coaching. It's really helping them to develop their own identities. Whether or not you allow them to be out with your team, really helping them understand that you accept them was really important for people. Promoting these conversations within your team, within your staff, across the board. And then encouraging athletes' identity expression. Assistant coaches really felt like athletes were going to be the ones paving the way. And so really encouraging them to be their diverse selves and be accepting could be very important moving forward. And that's it. Thank you.
Questions or comments for Melissa?
Yeah, Lindsay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, great question. All of them were dating someone and in very serious relationships. So the ones who were not open at all were single. So clearly there's something about reaching this stage of comfort and being in a relationship because they used it as a way to open it up. Oh, hey, team, this is my girlfriend, instead of being, hey, team, I'm gay. So it was really an easier way for them to normalize the identity, not make it something different, but just make it part of the conversation. So yeah, they really did use that as the entry point. Yeah, Dr. Kane.
I'm a member of the former generation, so my memory's a little shot. But did you say in the beginning what division they were, or are they all
Division I.
They're all Division I?
Mm-hmm. So it was a process getting them to participate.
Okay.
Yeah. No. No one has focused exclusively on assistant coaches, so I really felt it was important to hear what they were doing. It would be fantastic to look at dyads within that if it were humanly possible to get two who were willing to participate. But no, yeah, I did not. Yeah.
I was just wondering of the coaches that were out, did they mention at all feeling pressured that because they were out, they needed to be in a relationship to be less threatening to maybe their same-sex team?
Mm-hmm.
Anything
That's a great question, but they didn't. They really felt like their athletes were very accepting. Yeah, some of them had even coached athletes who pushed them to come out. They were like, we know that you're dating her and we want to meet her, so why aren't you bringing her around? So they really didn't have a problem at all with the athletes. It was more this top-down discrimination than anything with the athletes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was all women's basketball.
I have a question about your review of literature.
Yes.
What did you find previously? I mean, and is there much different from 30 years ago?
From assistant coaches, there's no research on assistant coaches from back then at all. And then the earliest one that I have found on actual sort of the idea of how lesbianism actually affects and in terms of interviews with them is Inglis and colleagues, Danilchuk, I never say the name correctly, but, and they really thought that it impeded their ability to move forward, but there wasn't a lot of research back then, to be honest. It was more, this is how we hypothesize, but not lesbians specifically sampled. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. A few didn't mention specifically where they got it. It was just known. But one in particular, when she was promoted, was told, I hope you take some discretion with this position, especially regarding negative recruiting. And so it was directly told to her that she knew she was not supposed to. The rest just knew. They had other teams actively point them out as gay. So they had heard back from players who had gone to other schools that they were being told there were lesbians on the staff. And so they knew the negative impact it had, and they just wanted to stay quiet about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is to your advantage if you have a daughter who's a lesbian and she's out to you and you love her and you support her so that negative recruiting would backfire on you.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of lesbian athletes. So, but and yet everybody that I talk to about who you
One assistant coach said it believed exactly what you're saying. They had a lesbian recruit on campus, and they were doing skits to entertain each other, and one of them threw a lesbian reference in there, and the head coach actually left the room and said they had to stop doing the skits. So for her, she said if we had promoted this environment, we could have landed this great recruit, and here he is sort of pushing us all to display, no, we do not allow any mention of lesbianism around here. So yeah, a few did agree with you. Mm-hmm.
and that somebody should try to back remember, but to break through, because I think it's counterproductive in some cases.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I completely agree with you. It's just that point where even some of the coaches I talked to were 22, so they just graduated from college. They're part of this, way ahead of the curve, and they get there and they immediately close up because that's what they're taught to do. So, hopefully someone does start to do that, or the athletes have to actively challenge it, like I mentioned some of them do, because otherwise change seems to just sort of reproduce itself. So, yeah. Yeah, great question. South is awful. South is terrible. I know that's very surprising. The rest really felt like it more mattered about how big your university was. So whether you were at a mid-major or a major Division I school was really influential in the social climate around it. But everyone did not like the South, really did not think they would be able to work there. And the few who did not have a great time doing so.
Did you have anything to do with the competitiveness of the program, or how they won the national championships, or are they motivators, or did that impact it at all?
No. They were really all focused on the relational component of being involved with the head coach. In terms of how, when I asked how the past year might have gone, some of them said we had a bad year, so it sucked. But everywhere else, they didn't mention it. It could, but I asked more open-ended questions, so it might have.
Okay, well, in the sake of time, let's give Alyssa. Very good. It's really interesting. I hope you're sitting there thinking how these first three have really intersected in very kind of complex ways. Different topics, but a lot of overlap, good things to think about. So our last, certainly not least presentation will be a little departure from the first three on sport media. So I will turn it over to John, and he'll play cleanup hitters.
Okay, just a little bit about myself, my background. I'm originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, from Miami University, where I completed my undergraduate degree in marketing and sports studies. And I also continued my education at Miami University by completing a master's in sports studies as well, where through that I got an interest in gender, sport, and media. So that kind of is where this research kind of developed from, is from my master's thesis. So as you can see, this title here is the Sport and New Media Complex. And I'm going to be describing to you guys the contested terrain of gender and sport news blogs. And before we get started, it's pretty important to understand that internet usage in America has increased dramatically to having over 260 million users across America and involving 76% of the population. And as a result, the term new media has emerged to describe the variety of internet-based resources such as websites, blogs, podcasts, online video, fantasy sports, video games, and so on. And currently, sport fans are spending over 13 hours a week online viewing sport content, which I think is a little bit on the low side, to say the least. And also, the internet has bypassed newspapers and television as a leading source for how sport fans gather information surrounding sport. And more specifically, the blogs are becoming increasingly utilized to gather this information, as this is seen as Deadspin, which is the country's most popular sports blog. In 2005, when it first came out, there were over 600 million page views in Deadspin alone. Just kind of shows you the power and influence of the growing area of sport blogs. And given this nature of how fans are gathering information in new ways, we need to go from transitioning from traditional media representations surrounding women's sport to how that translates over to new media representations surrounding gender and sport. And in order to understand this, I used a theoretical framework that combined traditional media research and new media research as well. And more specifically, I focused on Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model, which was a sharp contrast in 1980 from how previous traditional media research was focused on. That previous research kind of viewed fans as just consuming sport text in like one singular meaning, and that was it. But Hall's encoding-decoding model, however, emerged and described a rather complex relationship where messages are encoded into text by producers, and then the readers decode those messages in unique ways, kind of depending on their different circumstances they're involved with and so on. However, it's also important to recognize, as Hall points out, that dominant ideologies still maintain power and influence, despite the ability of readers to interpret messages in unique ways. Additionally, it's also important to interpret sport media text within a highly commercialized context, as this is described by Sut Jolly's sport media complex, which describes the interdependence of sport media to work together to have increased audiences and to increase popularity of sport while also increasing popularity for media outlets as well. So you have this relationship where they're both kind of working off of each other. And as a result of the increased commercialization within sport, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to blur the lines between commercialization and sport. It's becoming so commercially powerful and involved that you can't talk about sport necessarily without talking about the commercialization of it. Additionally, I also looked at new media and blog scholarship to kind of give myself a background and basis on how to interpret these texts as well. And in order to understand the traditional media themes, I found 4 prominent themes throughout the research. First is underrepresentation in women's sport. This is found through a variety of research has found that women's sport is underrepresented compared to male sport. And in 2009, for example, women's sport was covered in only 14% of USA Today articles, 11% of New York Times articles, and 1% of coverage on SportsCenter within 2009. Additionally, the theme of women athletes is inferior has also emerged, where female athletes are often trivialized and marginalized through representations that often trivialize their power, strength, and ability as female athletes and marginalizing their accomplishments. And additionally, the theme of heterosexualization and sexualization of female athletes emerges through blatant sexualized jokes and advertising campaigns that often emphasize the physical attractiveness of female athletes. And lastly, the theme of homophobia and fear of lesbian athletes also emerges, as lesbian athletes are often ignored within traditional media representations. And in order to deal with that, media representations often over-feminize female athletes in order to combat this fear of lesbian athletes through having athletes appear in feminine clothes, makeup, kind of like a hyper-feminized version of a female athlete. And they've also included representations that include a strong presence of husbands, fathers, and male coaches to kind of reinforce the heterosexuality of the female athletes. In order to get an understanding of the sports blogosphere and how gender kind of translates into that, I focused on 3 blogs in particular: Deadspin, Women Talk Sports, and Women's Hoops blog. And within this, I focused primarily on how the WNBA is presented and how it's discussed throughout these 3 blogs. And it was within a 3-year period from 2008 to 2010, in which I analyzed, through a narrative analysis, 30 blog entries on Deadspin, 33 blog entries on Women Talk Sports, and 36 within Women's Hoops blog. And by analyzing this, I focused on the blog entries themselves and also the discussion that occurred through discussion board comments by readers as well. And within Deadspin, the underrepresentation of female athletes is perpetuated as well, as there's only, within the 3-year period, 30 blog entries. I'm sorry, within 3-year period, only 30 blog entries surrounding women's sport. And they also focus on atypical controversies within women's sport. So not actually covering women's sport in terms of actually what's going on within the field, but focusing on kind of off-field kind of controversies I think that take place. And there's various examples of reference to women's athletes as inferior, including a kind of mockery and portrayal of Cynthia Fowles' dunk within the 2009 WNBA All-Star Game. And what I thought was very interesting, they even managed to view women athletes as inferior within post-game fights. So as you can see, there's a post-game fight involving Deanna Jackson of Chicago Sky, and blog author, which you guys will find here, I find very interesting. Blog authors have anonymous nature, so they make up their screen names. So you see a variety of unique screen names throughout my presentation. So we have MJ Deadspin, which described the contest as you see there. as slow, boring, but fundamentally sound. So obviously this is problematic because it marginalizes women's sport and it encourages and celebrates the fact that there's violence among females. And what I also found through the analysis of Deadspin is discussion boards operate as a site for resistance and negotiation. As some of you are familiar with, there's a recent sponsorship deal among the Phoenix Mercury and LifeLock, where the jerseys of the Phoenix Mercury actually had the LifeLock logo on there. And it's kind of like a bit of a controversy within the sport media world, as some people kind of viewed it as WNBA kind of selling out, kind of doing what they can to survive, while they somehow ignore numerous sports such as NASCAR, soccer in Europe, a variety of sports that have corporate logos embedded throughout their uniforms in virtually every place possible. And as blog author David Cohen frames the story, he frames it as the Deadspin is doing anything to not go under. Yet the discussion board comments emerge as a place for resistance and negotiation, as there's comments that you can see there from Fans Attic that says that this is, an interesting area, more teams should probably do this in the future. And then there also is kind of like a mediating force that the discussion board operates, as you have resistance and negotiations around women's sport. Then you also have kind of the same reinforcements of women athletes as inferior, as seen by Brewski's comment here. And additionally, Deadspin suggests that blog authors frame and spin a story to justify negative perceptions around women's sport. One story that they focus on I thought was very interesting is they give a lot of emphasis to a WNBA game that was moved from a different venue because of a scheduling conflict with Sesame Street Live. As you can see, the description there from David Cohen kind of making light of the situation as far as, look, this is what the WNBA has to deal with. This is kind of the reality that women's sports are allegedly boiled down to. But also what I thought was interesting is that while Deadspin does have a lot of anti-feminist views within the blog, there are options and there are also moments where they do engage in critical discussions around gender and sport that is significant. As you see this comment here by Tommy Craggs that addresses the concerns of the WNBA age requirement, being 22 years old. This came up within the past few years as Epiphany Prince of Rutgers left Rutgers when she was 21 to play basketball in Europe for a year, so she can go through and prepare herself more and play professional basketball until she's 22 when she come back to the States. Kind of something similar to what Brandon Jennings did within the NBA. And additionally, another example of how credit's given women's sport, but only in moderation, as Candace Parker's impressive WNBA debut is discussed. As you see here by this comment by Kogod, gives pretty high regard to Parker's efforts in her debut game for the Los Angeles Sparks. However, Kogod kind of catches herself in the moment and says, as you can see there, holy shit, did I just write a WNBA post? Dick joke. So you can kind of see that they are kind of potentially giving opportunities for female athletes to experience a recognition of their success and abilities, yet at the same time they're kind of conforming to the traditional media representations of female athletes as inferior. And then you also have a comment here that's from a discussion board response from a fan. In regards to sexualization, heterosexualization of female athletes, there's also a story that referred to Candace Parker breastfeeding before a game that she had. And obviously this is not really necessarily a sexualization of Candace Parker, that just kind of reinforced her being heterosexual and kind of taking away from her accomplishments as a female athlete by focusing on such an event as this. And what I noticed through this as well is a lot of the blog authorship did not necessarily focus on homophobia and fear of lesbian athletes, but a lot of this emerged through discussion board comments. As you can see through here, virtually any kind of WNBA story was not free from these type of comments. even a discussion surrounding the 2008 WNBA collective bargaining agreement became an event for them to bring up a fear and homophobia surrounding female athletes. Additionally, even a discussion surrounding LifeLock sponsorship at the Phoenix Mercury somehow managed to be an area where discussion board comments thought it was appropriate to engage in homophobic and information such as that. However, what I want to emphasize through this analysis of Deadspin is people kind of view something, blogs as this, as anti-feminist, but there is definitely a situation where there are elements of resistance and negotiation taking place as well. It's not necessarily a strict anti-feminist blog. And this is kind of evident through a critical discussion surrounding homophobia, as this is in reference to the Washington Mystics owner speaking out against the kiss cam being involved in the Washington Mystics game. The owner came out and said that they don't feel that it's appropriate because you have kids there and they don't want to be kind of viewed seeing, lesbians kiss on a kiss cam. Yet you do have blog author David Cohen who kind of brings up the fact that, why is this such an issue? And this is definitely in sharp contrast to Women Talk Sports and Women's Hoops blogs. Obviously, it's a sharp contrast because there's a high representation surrounding women's sport. It's often discussed in a more positive way, which focuses on the skills and abilities of female athletes as opposed to off-court controversies and stories such as Deadspin did. And in terms of sexualization and heterosexualization of female athletes, what I thought was very interesting is it provides a very unique opportunity to engage in critical discussions surrounding this topic. For example, in 2009, Candace Parker had an appearance in ESPN the magazine, and throughout the article is very sexualized in the way they spoke about her. As you can see here through the quote from ESPN the magazine, which is an extreme focus on her appearance as a female athlete, not really engaged in any discussion surrounding her skill and ability. Then you have the response from Q McCall, which is a blog author within Women Talk Sports, who kind of views it as a point to kind of engage in a critical discussion surrounding the sexualization of female athletes. However, despite these opportunities to engage in critical discussions, you do have opportunities where this kind of becomes reaffirmed and reestablished through women's sports as well. And this took place through a blog authorship by Jane Schoenberger, in which she paid a lot of attention to the draft day choices of WNBA athletes during the 2009 WNBA draft, kind of reaffirming the fact that female athletes need to be careful of what they wear, need to be presentable in a very attractive manner. As mentioned before, these blogs also provide a unique opportunity to engage in critical discussions surrounding traditional media themes. And this is also viewed through the homophobia and fear of lesbian athletes. As Pat Griffin, who posted some comments regarding the elimination of the kiss cam in Washington Mystics games. As you can see up there, what her comments were. So in sum, what the sport new media complex provides is unique opportunities that occur, but yet you still have the traditional influence of traditional media. And kind of the main point I want to put across here is the traditional media still maintains influence. As blogs, they aren't just blog authors developing stories on their own. They're often in reference to traditional media sources. Throughout the analysis, there's countless stories that referenced New York Times articles, Chicago Tribune articles, Los Angeles Times, Arizona Republic articles. So they're taking information from traditional media, and they might be adding a couple sentences of their kind of analysis and take on it, but yet they're still kind of reaffirming traditional media. So obviously you're going to have the continued emphasis on traditional media outlets through a convergence. And what I also thought was very interesting as well is the marriage of sport, media, and commerce also continues, as Deadspin generates annually approximately $400,000 per year in advertising revenue. As I mentioned before, Deadspin kind of markets and perpetuates traditional media themes surrounding gender and sport as a way to kind of reaffirm female athletes as perceived being inferior, and a variety of those other themes as well. And what I also thought was very interesting is Hall's encoding decoding model has basically been turned upside down, figuratively and literally. Through his model, you have an encoding of messages and then eventual decoding of messages by the audiences. Here it has a circular effect where the audience is able to make messages themselves, kind of form a circular approach to this understanding of sport media context. And as I mentioned before, the meeting is heavily negotiated with the discussion board comments. This is definitely an area that we need to kind of focus in as sports scholars, is the fact that while there is this kind of emphasis on traditional media representation surrounding women's sport, there's opportunities for resistance and negotiation as well. And what I thought was also very interesting is it's also interesting to understand that all this is occurring within an unedited nature of sport media context and portrayals. So you have people that are writing stories in anonymous nature. They're not really giving their full names, their full description of themselves, and they're engaging in very blatant and homophobic references to female athletes. It's not, it goes from traditional media representations that kind of hint at those kind of assertions to more blatant, homophobic, unedited nature of comments. And despite that, Women Talk Sports, Women Hoops blog provides an opportunity to challenge these dominant notions surrounding women's sport, which are prevalent within traditional media outlets.